in now and check it out.
Going to go to jail for 20, 30 years under him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, now we got started off on the right note. Y'all know who it is up next. It's the author, activist, entrepreneur, OG, trailblazer, warrior for justice, spitter of all things truth. And you know what? He's also a dope girl dad. Y'all give it up for the man, our friendly neighborhood outlaw, Luke Scarmazzo.
Yeah. So check it out, man. Man, it's a wonderful Wednesday. You know we're coming to you live and direct from the Northern Kingdom, the king and queen in the north. And I'm bringing you that outlaw news that I love to cover because, man, it's just like, it's almost laughable sometimes. And this one is laughable.
One of those.
This is definitely one of those laughable ones. So my headline reads, St. Johns County ex-sheriff used marijuana in car. Here's why he wasn't arrested. So now we have, well, a whole article telling you why somebody wasn't arrested. That usually means they probably should have been, right? Well, we'll see. You be the judge. David Shore was pulled over for running a red light and given a warning after marijuana was confiscated. The former sheriff of St. Johns County was not issued a ticket or arrested after he was pulled over with 8 grams of marijuana in his vehicle Friday night, an incident report states. David Shore, who served as sheriff from 2004 to 2021, quite a tenure there, Mr. Sheriff, was pulled over at Pope Road and A1A Beechwood Boulevard. Dang, I didn't even know that was in there. Okay. Shout out Vanilla. About 9 p.m. after failing to stop at a red light before making a turn. The incident report from St. Augustine Beach Police Department states. During the traffic stop, officers observed pieces of marijuana on the vehicle's center console while collecting Shore's driver's information. The officer noted in the report that he had a very strong odor of marijuana coming from the car.
Must have been good weed.
Usually that means he was tacking it out, but I don't know. We'll find out maybe. Shore had a valid medical marijuana license at the time of the traffic stop. However, the substance was not in its original package and clearly had been used inside the vehicle, the report states. So he arrested people for years and then went and got a medical marijuana license.
Right.
And then I guess perhaps shops at the Trap or maybe a valid store that still sells in baggies. I don't know.
Florida, by the way. This is Florida.
The officer confiscated the marijuana to submit as evidence for destruction. David was given a verbal warning for both the traffic violation and having marijuana in the vehicle. Shore was subsequently released from the scene.
I wonder what would happen. I wonder what would happen if this person would not have been a police officer.
Maybe would have been black or brown.
Maybe.
I think this would have been a completely different outcome. I don't know.
The right to remain silent.
I feel like
anything you say can and will be used against you.
I feel like this cop just isn't that quick-witted, because if I was him, I would have instantly said, you know what, I seized this from some kid, I used officer discretion, and I didn't want to ruin his life, but I did seize the weed.
He hasn't been an officer since 2021, so that would have been kind of a hard pull. But he may still been over to do
was 3 years old.
Citizen's arrest or something. I don't know. The point is this to me, there's more to the article. It talks about why he wasn't arrested and all this BS, but it's obvious to anyone just reading this on face value that if it would have been anyone else driving in that car, or 90% of anyone else driving that car, they would have been in jail. They would have had to bail out. They would have had to call their job, probably got fired from their job, and all this other stuff that didn't happen to this guy who just got the pat on the back and, hey, Dave, you have a nice day, and I'll bring this marijuana back to your house after I get off later on today.
We'll smoke it together.
So
after we destroy it, right?
The double standard here is egregious and glaring, but it's part of the dual standard that we have in our justice system. The rich and predominantly white people in society, and I hate to play the race card like that, but I was in prison and Dale was in prison, and we see who the majority of people are around us. It's poor people, it's people of color, And what happens in these situations is they get broke off, and the people of privilege and people that have ex-sheriff titles to their name, they get let go. And that's just the way things go. And it's sad. It's a sad state of affairs. Hopefully it's something that we can correct. But justice, the arc of justice is slow, to quote another, I believe it was Mark Twain.
The arc of
or no,
justice.
that was Einstein, actually. It was Einstein, excuse me. So, yeah, I mean, what do you guys think about this?
I mean, I think what's kind of funny is, like you were saying, if the circumstances were different, if the person getting pulled over was different, you know, that 8 grams of marijuana that they confiscated would have been put on a table and said they had a street value of like $20,000 or some bullshit like that.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, there's the flip side of this coin too, though, right? Because not all law enforcement feels that the laws around cannabis are rational or reasonable, right? And also, I can't speak for Florida, but I can speak for a number of acquaintances in law enforcement that I have in California. When they encounter people violating the open container law, so to speak, in California, if you're driving and you clearly have been smoking in the car, or your container's not in the back and out of, you know, control and reach, they're not inclined to do much about it either, because it's more paperwork for them than anything. And a lot of times these cases just get thrown out. So it's what I'm trying to get to at the very end of this is not all law enforcement feels the same way that traditional law enforcement has about this plant. And it's always a weird element for us in the industry, I think, because there's this person who has been seen as the enemy for a very long time, right? The complete op. But now we're starting to see more law enforcement officers engaging with this plant. And we, the facilitators of this plant, want that, right? And so we have to be careful not to slap law enforcement officers too hard.
True.
When they're showing positive activity towards our mission.
That's a good point. That's a very good point, because I guess, you know, I'm looking at this through a colored lens, and of course our experiences with mine and Dale's make us do that in certain occasions. And but she's right. You know, perhaps maybe the officer pulling it over was a supporter of cannabis and didn't think it was that big of a deal. I applaud officers that use their discretion in that sense and not clog up our system with BS nonviolent cannabis offenses or infractions or fines and burden people with money, because oftentimes that's people who are on the lower income bracket that can't afford those fines. But, you know, hey, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt here. And I think Mandy is right in the sense that there are officers that are coming around to this. I think that there are officers in certain localities that are being allowed to use cannabis, and as long as it's not on the job and stuff like that. So I think the tent is getting broader, and I think everyone is welcome in the tent of cannabis for sure. Like even when we were running our dispensary, see, the dispensaries back in the 215 era looked a lot different than they do now, obviously, to a lot of people. But the thing that was really special about them back then, it was a really eclectic group of people that used to come in. You would see firefighters and law enforcement officers and attorneys and city council members and skaters and surfers and you know, everything. It was like every walk of life that you could see, and it was all congregated at the dispensary back in the 215 era. So to get back to that point, to get back to the point where cannabis is the uniter and the acceptor of everybody, I believe that is a good thing and a positive thing. However, I'm always going to remain skeptical, because I know the culture of law enforcement. I know how they're trained. I know how they're taught. I've had conversations with many law enforcement officers in this regard about how they're trained and how they're taught to look at things and how they're taught to police. And I believe that pendulum is starting to swing back the other way. I believe it's starting to change. I believe that they're being held more accountable now, but I don't think it's enough. I think we need to continue to go further.
I think also
I actually represented cops back in the 90s and even in the 80s. And in those days, they knew that the laws about marijuana were bullshit, but they were tools they could use. You smelled weed, you had probable cause to search a car, search a house. They don't want to give that stuff up. And the term tools, I think, is a pejorative in this sense, because they just beat people up. Okay. And when I was working inside there, they all knew that Molly smoked weed. But she was their favorite substance abuser, so she was never going to get stopped. I had a concealed weapons permit. No cop was going to do shit to me, never search my car. I was inside that privilege. I've seen it. And it was the policymakers, and still the policymakers, and that's why this DOJ, this former U.S. attorney statement is informative. The policymakers still want to beat the drum of let's go out and fight drugs. The cops who got to do it are like, this is horseshit. Why are we doing this? People smoke weed are not dangerous like drinking alcohol. What are we doing here? And I think that's what this story shows, that the beat cops are like, it's more paperwork than it really is worth. Okay. And that's a grand statement right there, because it used to be, paperwork. Now I've got PC to search your house, your life, your car, everything.
I think it's also going to be interesting to see what happens when we have this whole next generation of law enforcement, Gen Z or whatever the next generation is. Because, for example, the ex-sheriff that's in this story here, I think it's hard for us. It's hard for us to kind of wrap our head around that as people that have been around cannabis since it was not legal, since it was illicit market days. Because in the back of our mind, I just have a gut feeling that person has more than likely fucked somebody's life over possession, So now I think it's going to be a very different perspective that we could have for this new wave of law enforcement that potentially became a cop after a state had already become legal, and maybe they've never actually done that in their career. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic and that relationship between like the outlaw culture that still resides within cannabis interacts with this new wave and this new philosophy for law enforcement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, and it's also, to add to that, is not only is it the next generation coming up in states that have been completely legalized, but they're also coming up without the stigma, and they're also coming up in it without the propaganda that was hammered into our younger generation with the DARE programs and the Just Say No's and all those things. So they're coming up with a mentality of that surrounds cannabis that's completely different. So I think that's actually a really good point, that as these next generation of law enforcement officers come up in through the ranks, I believe we will see a shift in mentality and hopefully a shift in culture of the law enforcement community.
Yeah, and I think like to add to that, we also see what's happened in the past 3 years with George Floyd and a lot of these other very publicized instances of police abuse. I would hope that leads, that we're leading to an area where there's more accountability and transparency, which I think will ideally, in an ideal world, will attract a better set of individuals to become police officers than potentially happened 20, 30 years ago.
I don't know. I think that's all. I think that's all the dream world.
Yeah, I said hopefully.
You guys are all living in a dream world.
You know what? I think, like you said, like the next generation of police officers, I do believe, 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be all robots and run by AI, and they're going to be just. It's
going to be woke AI with ESG scores and everything.
You want to know why they have been stalling out on like a lot of the facial recognition software and everything? Because it's racist as fuck.
It's racist.
The system
facial recognition is racist.
Yes, it is. Yes.
It's because it's written. That code is written by engineers that are predominantly white men. So like their biases are going to come through into their code.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
man.
I do think that it's going to be run by like robots and private police. So it will be interesting times indeed. And so I'm making as much money right now as possible. Get the fuck on my island.
Yes, right.
Not have to deal with these